You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with economist and broadcaster Steve Richards and the former government special advisor Salma Shah. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. And according to the Financial Times, the Prime Minister is likely to face opposition from some of his own MPs over the introduction of so-called COVID passports, which would allow people to prove they don't have the virus and gain entry to public venues. The Metro urges readers to book your table now after Boris Johnson confirmed pubs and restaurants will reopen next week as scheduled. As the Express puts it, cheers, we're opening for business. The Guardian says Mr Johnson has pledged a return to a semblance of normality. The next stage of the so-called roadmap is also the top story for The Eye. Their headline, lockdown eases up next week for pubs and shops. The Daily Telegraph leads with that too, but says some COVID measures could remain in place even after all adults have been offered a vaccine. And that's also the top story in the Daily Mail. And with us tonight, Steve Richards and Salma Shah to take us through the newspapers. Good to see you. Welcome. Let's start with The Guardian, first of all, and that headline, some semblance of normality promised by the Prime Minister in that briefing this evening. Steve, you've had a look at this.
Yeah, well, as your introduction to all the front pages shows, the mood is quite different depending on what front page you look at, whether it's kind of quite downbeat or upbeat. And the reason for it is in that Guardian headline, a return to a semblance of normality. What precisely does that mean, the semblance of normality? And it's not entirely clear. In fairness to the government, there's no reason why it should be entirely clear, given that there are some still unpredictable factors in this whole saga. But given that, the front pages really then differ. Some are excited by the return of a semblance of normality. Others think, why can't we have that now, given the success of the vaccines? And so within that, there are many questions. Vaccine passports, yes or no? Why can't things open more quickly, et cetera, et cetera? And it all, I think, does revolve around the perhaps unavoidable lack of clarity about what a semblance of normality means.
Yes, and that was the criticism of that news conference, wasn't it, Salma, that there wasn't enough detail. People still were left with very many questions even after the briefing.
Yeah, there's still a lot of questions, and there are questions that the government themselves can't answer at the moment because, you know, as the Prime Minister's talked about before, they're going to be led by data, not dates. And this gradual unlocking is going to show the data that is coming in and show the spread of the virus. And the Prime Minister also said that we're expecting to see a slight spike when we start seeing hospitality starting to open up again. I do think it's interesting. You know, Steve is absolutely right. Depending on which paper you read, it depends on whether it's going to be upbeat or downbeat. But there are lots of critical factors here that the government is still not aware of, which means that this caution is important.
Yeah, the Telegraph, slightly different take. Normality a long way off, no end in sight. As Johnson says, normal is some way off. Slightly different take, isn't that, from the Guardian?
Yeah. I think.
Oh, sorry. Carry on.
Sorry, I was just going to say it's a different take from the Guardian, because I think also the Telegraph is keen on getting the economy opened up again, and also it's what does normality actually mean. So whereas you see with the Guardian it's talking about a semblance, this is actually challenging that a little bit more and saying, okay, what does normal really look like and what are we expected to regard as normal? Because the briefing today as well was talking about the vaccination not being 100%, which is what the Telegraph cites in the front page in its copy, and the fact that not everybody is going to choose to take up a vaccination. So there are still some difficulties in the road ahead, and I think they're legitimate questions to ask for the Telegraph of the government and how the government is going to think about addressing some of these anomalies.
Steve, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I just think it's very interesting, the ubiquity of this term normal. You know, what do people expect by normal? That city centres will be as packed as they used to be, that offices will be packed again with people working in them, commuting from all over the place? Or will there be some changes, which means normal is different? Now, we know to some extent what they mean. They want people to be able to go to restaurants, to go to houses indoors quite quickly. But I think the caution of the government is wise and is in marked contrast to some of the things we've experienced with them over the last 12 months, and to follow the timetable. The reason why some papers are upbeat is we knew this was going to happen. It'd been amazing if it hadn't. But, you know, some things are going to reopen next Monday, isn't it? April the 12th.
Yes.
So they are following a timetable. I think this kind of focus on normal, this word, is not very helpful for anyone, really. It is spectacularly imprecise while appearing to be very clearly defined. So they're sticking to the timetable. But within that, as we've both been discussing, there are huge questions about the way forward after April the 12th.
Yeah, so you're wanting to avoid the word normal, but normally a lot of people would be booking their summer holidays around this time, if not already booked, and that was something that we didn't get any clearer detail on. There was a lot of caution from the Prime Minister on whether people should actually even book summer holidays now. Salma?
Yeah, and I think that it too is sensible, because we are seeing a third wave going across Europe whose vaccination programme has not been anywhere near as successful as the UK's. So this traffic light system that has been announced, I think is going to be, there's going to be a long way off before a lot of countries are in green. So I think that's all we had, and I think we're going to have to wait a little bit longer before we have anything definitive on what foreign travel looks like. And also, in relation to vaccination passports, we're also going to have those for international travel, let alone, the sort of plans of whether you're going to get one to go to the pub or not.
Yeah, it's not going to be easy, however we look at it, because even with the traffic light system, Steve, if you travel to a green area and spend a couple of weeks, by the time you leave to come back, it could be a red area.
Yeah, I mean, these holidays could be a form of hell, let's be honest. And the other thing here is that quite a lot of the assessment is if this is wholly in the control of the, for England anyway, the government at Westminster. It's obviously hugely dependent on what other countries decide. We were with some friends today. We said, oh, should we go to France? As if, if the government here wants us to go, that's fine. Of course, it's up to France. Or Macron or whoever to decide as well. So they're not fully in control of travelling abroad this summer. They're obviously going to give more information in the coming weeks, but their room for manoeuvre on this is quite limited.
And Salma, let's move to the Financial Times, and they're looking at the backlash from Tory MPs about COVID passports. I mean, there's quite a split. There were 70 MPs, I think about 40 of them Tories, who were against the idea of domestic passports, but it was something that was hinted quite strongly at in that news briefing earlier.
Yeah, hinted quite strongly at, but not as strongly as some of the briefing we've seen previously, which suggests that there might be a little bit of trepidation, given that there's going to be some political difficulties in getting this through. So the Financial Times has a report from Mark Harper, MP, who is leading what is called the COVID recovery group, saying the domestic COVID passport or certification. So this is not going to be an easy thing to get through Parliament because of the civil liberties issue. And it will be interesting to see politically what Keir Starmer does with the Labour whip, and to see whether he actually does support the government in introducing this. So even the best laid plans, the best laid intentions, whatever the science says, the politics of this are really going to matter in the next few days.
Yeah, but the Prime Minister was saying that it's not likely that you would need certification for essential to go to the shops, but perhaps to go to a concert or something of that like. Steve?
Yeah, I mean, he was saying, for example, you won't need it to go to a pub garden next week when the gardens reopen, but that was never that's not the issue of contention. No one expected that to be the case. It is, as you say, bigger public events and possibly going indoors in pubs, restaurants, whether some kind of proof of having the vaccine is required. And I mean, I think there are strong arguments for it, but I haven't got a vote in the House of Commons if there is a vote. And this is very interesting because Starmer has been so criticised for abstaining at key moments. I think it looks as if he's veering towards perhaps deciding to vote against. Clearly, no final decision has been made. But actually, the abstentions he's done in the past have actually been quite constructive, that he criticised some of the specific proposals, but wanted a measure in place, so they abstained. But he's been so knocked about for abstaining. It could be that the government haven't got the numbers at the moment, with the Tory rebels and Labour contemplating voting against, assuming there is a vote.
OK, Steve and Salma, for the moment, thank you very much. Coming up, one would normally expect the Daily Mail to be supportive of Tory policies, but not this time when it comes to easing lockdown. We'll discuss that next. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. That's still with me to take us through the newspapers this evening. Steve Richards and Salma Shah. Welcome back to you. Let's have a look at the Mail, a paper that one might think would normally support the Prime Minister, but not so. Salma, call this freedom is the headline.
Yes, and there's a different sort of flavour amongst all the sort of writer-leaning newspapers. So we've seen the Daily Mail and the Telegraph already, so different elements of kind of concern. I think this is difficult generally for anybody who is pro-business and it slightly worries about state control. So whilst they understand that there's a pandemic on, I think there's a difficulty for everyone on the right who are considering how much state control somebody should have, or a government should have, pitted against the safety of the population in a pandemic. And I think these are one of the questions that I think Tory backbenchers are also grappling with at the moment.
And Steve, what's your view?
Well, again, it's really interesting, the use of terms. Call this freedom, ? As if anyone is asserting that what we're experiencing now or in the next few weeks is anything close to freedom. But maybe if this discipline remains in place, there will be a freedom from the virus, which has caused all the non-freedom for the last year. So again, how you use words in these situations is very revealing. However, I think, the Mail and the Telegraph, they have quite a lot of influence on governments, on this, Tory governments, well, actually all governments, from my experience. And they will read this with as much wariness as they read about Tory MPs rebelling against passports. So they are a factor in determining what happens in the coming months, but by no means the only one. And as I say, I don't quite know what they mean by freedom. Do they want everything back to normal? I've already said in the first half, it's not up to the government to decide when France opens itself up in terms of holidays, etc., etc. Freedom is a very vague term, which again sounds strong.
Salma, there have been some suggestions that perhaps we should be looking at our borders, especially in the light of this third wave, and we should be closing our borders in order to protect our citizens from being infected.
Yes, and I think in this instance, you have to really consider what the scientists are saying about how things travel. And I would personally be very afraid of border controls being so hard, but the vaccination needs to be protected, and the more mutations you have and the more things travel, the riskier that vaccination is in this tranche. So we already know that what spread in Europe the first time was not exactly the same as what came out of China, because it went through several different mutations. So the border question is a really tricky one, because there is actual science that says we have to reduce the risk of mutations. But, closing down the border, that is a really tough thing to do.
Steve, do you think that might be something that will be looked at if other countries are having rates of the infection rising, and we're actually doing quite well with our vaccination programme being so successful and our R rate being reduced. Might that be an area that will be one of concentration on?
Yeah, well, it already is. And there has been a considerable tightening of the borders compared, if you take a year ago, there was still a sort of free-for-all at UK borders. It was one of the reasons why there was such a heavy infection rate in the UK from about a year ago. I mean, to be honest, I think the question should be, are they tight enough now, given what we know about the potential impact of variants, and still not complete clarity about whether the vaccines protect everyone from all variants. So there needs to be real caution. And of course, I understand the impatience as reflected in the Mail and the Telegraph. But if this goes wrong, look at what's happening in Europe. If this goes wrong, we're going to lose all the freedoms again. So it has got to be done, I think, very cautiously.
Salma, just time for this little story in the Metro. Take us into the story about David Cameron.
Yeah, so this is obviously a continuation of the issues that is being looked at around lobbying. And again, Rachel Reeves, I believe, the Labour MP, is suggesting that there needs to be some legislation brought forward in the Queen's speech with relation to lobbying. The thing about this is that it's one of those perennial issues where anybody who sort of leaves a political career and then goes off and pursues their own job are always going to be sort of somehow pulled back into talking to their old contacts. So whilst I think it's laudable to say that we need better protections against lobbying, I just don't know how you practically bring legislation forward to prevent people from talking to the Treasury, in this case, about things that are materially significant to jobs and the economy.